Welcome, Matthew Fox. I'm so happy to meet you and welcome you to the Seekers Forum.
Thank you, Mark. It's real good to be with you.
Thank you. So I've really been loving your book about Julian of Norwich. And the first question I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in the book that the plague killed creation spirituality. And I'm curious, in your words, how would you describe how the pandemic is affecting spirituality in general?
Well, to just put a little note on your point about how in the 14th century, Julian century, this plague was so severe, it killed between 1 out of 2 and 1 out of 3 people. And it made people so freaked out about nature. Up until then, you had this creation-centered spirituality where you found the divine in nature. But of course, they had no science like we have. They had no vaccinations. And so many people freaked out, but not Julian. But it's actually Thomas Berry, the great eco-philosopher, who said that the Black Plague killed creation spirituality. And then if you look at religion after the 14th century, it turns to being all about sin and redemption. It's all about sin and redemption. The entire Protestant Reformation was about that. And the Roman Catholic Church's response was about that, sin and redemption. And so you might say the sacredness of creation fell off the map in religion right up to today. And then, of course, when science and religion split in the 17th century, you had another issue around nature and creation because science said, we'll go and explore nature, you guys explore the soul. And these Augustinian believer types who are dualistic and believe that that you cannot find spirit in nature and in matter, they said, oh, what a deal, we'll do that, we'll take the soul and you guys take the universe. And we know what's happened with that, that our civilization is schizophrenic and dangerous because science has uncovered all these powers of the universe on the one hand, but pretty much without a conscience. And on the other hand, religion has become more and more introspective and silly. There are exceptions, of course, such as, well, the late Bishop Tutu and Mandela and Martin Luther King and others. But the point is that the movement in culture of religion and spirituality has been distorted by this problem. So back to the other part of your question. Today's situation and the pandemic, well, I do think that hibernating at home has made some people crazy and others a little more introspective and healthy and asking questions, for example, of what am I doing with my life? And am I really contributing in my work to something worthwhile? In other words, the presence of death is a very fine reminder for people that, we've all got a finite time here on earth. Are we using our best talents to give back? Is my life meaningful? And so I think that would be the silver lining in this circumstance. But at the same time, of course, we see this rise of craziness of people drinking mercury and horse medicine and all the rest on the one hand, and then the built-up anger and hostility that's rife around the world, not just in America, and the reaching for authoritarianism, for never having to make one's own decisions, but some Führer doing it for us. I mean, this rise of what I call the unholy masculine, the very disturbed masculine, the reptilian brain out of control. I think that's clearly on our the headlines. Here we're working up to the anniversary of January 6th. And so I do think that something like a pandemic unveils the best and the worst in us.
Right.
And of course, we have to praise the scientists who came up with the vaccine and these frontline workers of all kinds in the medical profession, but even in taxi cab driving and Uber driving and grocery store clerks and all the rest. I mean, that people are stepping up. And of course, hopefully there's a rebirth of community, a sense of the whole, and not just, maybe it can be the end of this rugged individualism, this John Wayne philosophy of life that has taken over such a big chunk of the American soul. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. I mean, sociologists say that fear leads to fundamentalism. And that seems to be what we see happening. The more scared people are, the more rigid they become, the less tolerant they become. And so it feels like a contest between the two. It doesn't feel like spirituality is necessarily prevailing at the moment.
It's not winning, no. Well, right. And that's a very good point, of course. Fear is the opposite of love, isn't it? So you either choose the path of fear or a path of love. And love is harder. Fear is a little more comfortable, really. That is to say, to work out of fear and then to create the enemy for projection's sake, the scapegoat. And of course, this happened in Julian's day too, a tremendous rise of scapegoating. So there was a rise of anti-Semitism in her time and of accusing of heretics and all this. But again, what's interesting about Julian, there's none of that in Julian. And then there is also this rise of guilt that many men especially felt that the plague was there because of their sins. And so they created these clubs, these flagellation clubs, when they went around to town beating themselves. They tried to go to 3 towns a day and beat themselves publicly in the square, the town square. And it got so popular that the Pope had to intervene and say, chill, cool it. This is not going to solve the bubonic plague for us. But it just shows that there was that too. And so that might be part of the shadow that we're experiencing today too, that there's some kind of guilt going on. It wouldn't be in the same religious language, maybe about sin, but it may be some stirring of awareness, of responsibility for what's missing in our culture. But how one deals with guilt is a whole nother subject, as you know, and there are many avenues by which we distort things. There's a wonderful line from Adrienne Rich, the feminist poet. She says that patriarchy creates fatalistic self-hatred. Fatalistic self-hatred. I think there's a lot of fatalistic self-hatred going around. Even the denial of climate change, for example. I mean, that's self-hatred because it's suicide. And, we have a whole party invested in denial about climate change, a whole party invested in fatalistic self-hatred. So in some ways, I step back from what's happening and I see it as it's kind of the end of patriarchy, but patriarchy is not dying with grace. Instead of thrashing out like a dinosaur with this big tail and trying to kill everything around it. So the question about who's going to come out victor here, as you said, fear or love, is very much up for grabs. Love is harder. And justice is harder than fear and scapegoating and even self-hatred. Self-hatred is kind of comes easy for a lot of people. And I think the whole ideology of original sin has set the West up for that. And I think that consumer capitalism also sets us up for that, because it's really saying this, giving the same message out that original sin is, and that is you don't have what it takes. You got to buy your way through life to prove you're here for a reason or something. They're both really saying that same thing. And that's why I think the theology of original blessing is a whole new start for a lot of Western civilization, because love has to begin with ourselves. I mean, even Jesus says you love others as you love yourself. Well, if we're distorted in our self-love, which is what fatalistic self-hatred surely is, then, we're already going downhill. Right. It strikes against us.
Right. I want to get into original blessing in depth, but first I wanted to ask you about what you say about all of us needing to become prophets now. I thought that was great, that you say every prophet interferes, that then the prophecy has two parts. It's sight or the vision and the announcing.
Mm-hmm.
And so how can we do that now? How can we become prophets in a moment when we need to raise our voices, but not against one another?
Mm. Yeah, well, right. We have to get in touch with our values, don't we? And they have to become important to us. And there is a purgation that we go through in a time like a plague like this. We're all giving up something. And many people are giving up their jobs and thinking differently about what to do with work when things get a little better. But yeah, I think that I'm sorry, the question again was
prophet. How can we become prophets?
Yeah, right. Well, those quotes you have are from Rabbi Heschel, essentially. He wrote the great volume on prophets, that they interfere. That's their primary work. And we're all called to interfere today, I think, with patriarchy, which is a worldview of power over rather than power with, shared power. And I do think that a lot of the authoritarianism today is definitely patriarchy on steroids. It's patriarchy applied to democracy. And there is this very real effort to kill democracy, not just in America, but in many countries around the world. And some have already succeeded in that. So I think the fear of democracy, because it is work, and I do think that a consumer culture like ours gets lazy about politics. It takes it for granted, things are going to be the same tomorrow and the next day, And, that's not going to cut the mustard. I think we have to do we believe that a democracy thing is healthy? And as Churchill said, it's the worst of all it's worse except for all the other options in government. And but it demands virtue. It demands an inner strength. And we have to develop that. Now, there's a wonderful line from William Hocking, the philosopher. He says, the prophet is a mystic in action. And I like that because we're all mystics and we're all prophets, or we're called to be. A mystic is the lover in us. The mystic says yes. And the prophet is the warrior who stands up and says, no, that we have to interfere. This is not the way to go. This is not healthy. And we're literally facing our extinction. I mean, the press doesn't talk about this enough. We are facing our extinction. One thing I like to meditate on these days is to count the various species of hominids that we are uncovering around the world. I mean, we've all heard of Neanderthal and some of these others, but now, especially in Asia, partly because of climate change and warming, we're uncovering all kinds of hominids. I think they've counted and named about 14 different species now. The bottom line is they're all gone. They're all extinct, except one. And that's us.
Right.
And I mean, we have to meditate on that and act on it too, because, the odds are not in our favor of succeeding. I think that humans have some real problems, some real shadow sides to us that have not been resolved. And they're showing and how to deal with anger is, of course, and violence is a big one. But again, I think this distorted masculinity. What is authentic masculinity? If you look up the word virtue in Webster's, it's so interesting. It comes, of course, from the word vir, which is man in Latin. But it goes on, it says that virtue is valor, it's virility, it's strength. Thomas Aquinas says it's the divine power in us and so forth. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's offering, that one word offers an alternative to how our culture defines masculinity. Mm-hmm. And it embarrasses, I think, a lot of men in our culture who are running around lying publicly and getting all of us in trouble because of lies, because truth finding is virtuous. That's virtue, but it takes some inner strength to come to truth and to admit that we have things to learn. None of us has all the answers, et cetera, et cetera. So I do see this whole thing as a big crisis about the balance of the masculine and the feminine. And you can't have a healthy feminine and an unhealthy masculine. And we've had an unhealthy masculine for a long time, for centuries.
Right. So what do you think about all of this backlash against virtue signaling and the sort of shadow of self-righteousness that you see in the left very often, in cancel culture?
Yeah.
Is that just a necessary pendulum swing, do you think?
I don't think it's necessary except in a patriarchal culture. I think that's part of it. I mean, what can I say? I've never been pleased with academia in America. I think it's been distorted from the get-go. This is why I created my universities my own way and deliberately brought in the right hemisphere of the brain, brought in art as meditation. And I think everyone from children to professional schools like law and business and all that should bring values into what they're doing. And we don't, it's like law is a game. Who's going to win? Who's going to be on top? And this applies to media and business and all the rest. It's as if we're on our own when it comes to values. But really, education is supposed to be about education and character, not just in facts and information and power. And of course, that's what it becomes. Thomas Berry used to say that most of the destruction of the planet today is happening at the hands of people with PhDs. And he also talked about what he called academic barbarism. Now, when I created a program for inner city kids who were dropping out of high school, and of course, it was for public school, I developed a practice, if you will, called the 10 C's, because this was a way about talking about values without talking religious language, which you can't do in a public high school. So it really worked. For example, among the 10 C's were character development, compassion, creativity, cosmology, chaos, which is a value within the inner city for sure. I mean, it's something they have PhDs in, and cosmology, ecology, and so forth. And we got the kids to play with this language and this thinking about values with these 10 C's, and then create movies around about whatever they're interested in, but using one or two of these C's, bringing these values in. And it was very effective. But, I don't see anyone else doing that. I don't see us teaching values in our educational system, and certainly not at the level of law. How else would we get these lawyers running around the country, lying to all of us and getting away with it? And I just don't get it, why we can't bring values into our professional worlds. Well, I don't think we can do it in the current model of education, which is all about the left brain and has nothing to do with the heart and nothing to do with the intuitive brain. Einstein said, I abhor American education. Why? Precisely for that reason. He says you're not teaching values. Values, he said, do not come from the rational brain. They come from the intuitive brain, which is what I call the mystical brain. And here in America, you get degrees for the rational side of things, right, but the intuitive is you're on your own.
So how does that connect into what the idea that postmodern times require pre-modern wisdom?
Well, you see, the problem with the modern era, and I think I used to say it began with the printing press, which really it did, 15th century, but I think it started a century earlier, if you will, or 75 years earlier, with the Black Plague, this preoccupation with fear. And with a separation from nature. And whereas before that, in your pre-modern worldview, whether you're talking indigenous people, or if you're talking the medieval mystics like Julian and Eckhart and Aquinas and Hildegard and so forth, they begin with the universe, with the whole picture, not with the human. And beginning with the human, I think, therefore I am, that is so modern, and it's so dangerous, and it's so passé now. And Descartes couldn't have been more wrong. It's not because I think that I am, it's because the universe has prepared the table for me for 13.8 billion years. And this earth is a place of utter interconnectivity and community. It's not about the I, it's about us, the we, and how we interact with one another. And to the extent that we follow that ego agenda down that rabbit hole, we're going to kill ourselves and a lot of other creatures on this planet. I mean, we are doing that already. So it's very serious business. And the pre-moderns look for wisdom, not just knowledge. And that's another thing. Wisdom dropped off the table in the modern era because wisdom is feminine. She's feminine in the Bible. She's feminine around the world. Kuan Yin is over my shoulder here from the East. And wisdom is bigger than knowledge. And knowledge by itself is raw power. So wisdom gives us the reason why power is useful, but it also has these limits and so forth. So that balance of wisdom and knowledge is part of the needed balance of the masculine and the feminine that we're missing so desperately today. Mm-hmm. Years ago, I have a funny story to tell here about wisdom. Years ago, I got an invitation from the University of Vancouver to give 4 talks, and I could choose 3 topics, but the first topic had to be wisdom in the university today. And I sweated over that talk and sweated over it, and I flew out to Vancouver. I didn't have a talk ready, and I had a talk at 1:30 in the afternoon, and I took a bath, saying maybe I'll get an answer in the bathtub, and I did. The answer, the message I got was tell the truth. Oh, that's an idea. So I stood up in front of about 400 faculty and staff and students. My opening line was, and it was right after lunch, about 1:30, everyone was laid back in their chairs, having eaten. And my opening line was, talking about wisdom in the university today is a bit like talking about chastity in a brothel. And I'll never forget the response. Everyone rose from their chairs like a tide coming in. And we had a very lively discussion about when wisdom was murdered in education. And it was murdered in the modern era because the feminine was thrown out the door. And we have, no one's been looking for it since. It's not even in our vocabulary. But this is what the pre-moderns, both in Europe, but also among indigenous people, they begin with the universe. Hildegard's whole consciousness is about macrocosm and microcosm. We are the microcosm, but we fit into a macrocosm, and what she called the web of life and the web of creation. And she said, if we disturb that web, she said, God will allow creation to punish humanity. And I think that's what climate change is. I think we're getting our rewards for how narrow our mindset has been for centuries. It's all about extracting stuff from Mother Earth to make money and power and all the rest with our agendas, and not asking the questions until recently, what price is Mother Earth paying for this, and will future generations pay for it? Right. So wisdom is so needed today, but it can't be done in a patriarchal educational system, or patriarchal religion, patriarchal politics, or economics. Right. And we see this fierce resistance. So we know we're talking about something real here.
Absolutely. I love you say rationalism is the sin of the spirit appropriate to the modern era.
Did I say that? That's a good line.
Yeah, it's a very good line. I love that. And Heschel said, we can't comprehend by analysis what we become aware of through awe.
Yeah. But see, it's that awe is the door to wisdom, isn't it? And so that's what's so important and so missing. Where do you bring awe into education, for example? And because there's a certain cynicism. Oh, I've seen it all before. That's part of the patriarchal world we live in. And instead of, but again, there's cacophony. I mean, this latest burst of launching of the Webb telescope, how exciting that is, and how much more already Hubble has fed us so much awe in 10 years or so. But imagine how much more we're going to get from this if it works. And it's awesome that we're able to do that 29 different countries participated in this. Thousands of scientists and others created this option, this hope that we'll learn even more about our origins and about this amazing, awesome universe of which we have been invited to, of which we are a part. I mean, that should be lesson number one in every class. Like I say, if you're going to teach medicine, the first question is, what's awesome about being a nurse? What's awesome about being a doctor? That's what you should tell future nurses and doctors. And the same goes for any profession worthy of its name. What's awesome about it? Not how much money you make. That's a later question. What's awesome about it? And how does it awaken generosity in you and make you a better person, a wiser person? Those are questions that I think we're not asking enough. But to survive, we got to start asking again.
I mean, at this point, you've been through so much with the church and in and out and changing denominations. And is religion our friend, Matthew? I just read The End of Faith, Sam Harris's book. Again, I don't know if you've read that, but it's very easy to see religion as the problem, like the fundamental problem here. Do you believe that?
Well, I think there's a saying in the Middle Ages, corruptio optimi est paceba. The corruption of the best is the worst. So there's nothing worse than bad religion. It's dangerous. And one of my crusades has turned out to be the original sin ideology. I just think it does horrible things to not just to the soul of individuals, but to society. And I think that, in fact, a secular version of original sin, as I alluded to earlier, is consumer capitalism. I think they're both saying the same thing, and that we don't have what it takes. But Hildegard of Bingen said that we have everything that is necessary is inside of us. We have everything that's needed inside of us, but we have to, get together with others and their wisdom. So when religion is healthy, like it was with Bishop Tutu and Mandela and Martin Luther King and Gandhi, I mean, it's wonderful. It brings the courage out of people. It brings truth alive. It brings justice out of injustice. And think not just about overthrowing apartheid, but that justice and reconciliation experience afterwards, where they got the perpetrators telling their story and their truth, along with the victims. That kind of thing is amazing. The power of forgiveness and healthy religion can bring that forward. But as was said years ago, that truth is the basis of liberation. Only the truth can make us free. So healthy religion is powerful. But I do think we're in an era where religion is more interested in, most of religion more interested in itself than it is in the survival issues of today. And so that's why we distinguish between spirituality and religion. And I had this intuition years ago in my 20s when I told my Dominican superiors I wanted to study spirituality, because I said my generation will be more interested in spirituality than religion. And I think I'm right. And of course, spirituality is the renewal of religion. As Father B. Griffiths says, all religions began with spiritual experience. The Buddha under the Buddha tree, and the prophets in Israel, and Muhammad with the Quran, and certainly Jesus. And then, as he says, it gets organized because people want to share this good news. And then that's the beginning downhill, when you get organized, and then you create doctrines, and you create a language for it, and then you create seminaries to teach people these things. Yeah. And you have to be alert and be willing to start over regularly. And because that's how we are as human beings. It's easier to be complacent and say, oh, things are running okay. But no, so I do think we're in a time when it's becoming obvious to a lot of people, especially young people, that religion is not the future, but spirituality is. But of course, my work has been to show that within the lineage from which I come, the Christian and Jewish tradition, that there's a lot of wisdom in there. And that's why these wisdom people like Julian and Aquinas and Hildegard and so forth are so important to me, because it's like taking the treasures from the burning building. I think religion itself is burning. And especially the young, because the young are on the edge. They're facing the extinction questions. And they don't have a lot of time to fool around with all the institutional stuff that religion is preoccupied with. It's about survival today. So I talk about working not with basilicas on our back, but with backpacks on our back. And that's spirituality, like troubadours. And also, I'll go another way too. I don't think we can, I think it's a luxury to think of long, long hours of meditation and sitting on cushions and all the rest. I think we need portable practices that strengthen the heart and that we can take into action, because that prophetic dimension is so important. It needs to be fed, but I think it's kind of a luxury to think that I think the day of big monasteries and so forth is over. I think, and Father B. Griffiths said, the future of monasticism is lay people. And so I think that we can draw from all these gifts of our ancestors, but we have to apply them to today's issue, which is literally a survival extinction issue.
Mm-hmm. And getting patriarchy out of spirituality, getting patriarchy out of religion.
Yes, booting patriarchy.
Yeah.
And getting the divine feminine and wisdom in.
Yeah.
And it's not that hard. I mean, the women's movement has come a long way in our time, and in a very short time, maybe. And now men have to counter with an equal effort to find the healthy masculine. And of course, it's hard to do because the unhealthy masculine has profited, has been rewarded in these centuries. But that doesn't mean that you have to acquiesce to it and be lazy about really asking the deep questions. How does masculinity reform itself, renew itself?
And that original blessing really goes to the heart of that, doesn't it? Really,
I think it does.
Reversing the whole idea of this assumed sin that creates a system of redemption and punishment, etc.
Exactly. Yeah. And the fatalistic self-hatred. I've been saying lately that I think that 98% of Christian preachers have had the first page of their Bible ripped out by somebody. Because the first page of the Bible, Genesis 1, doesn't say one word about sin or redemption. It's about the goodness, and the word goodness is repeated about 7 times. And ultimately, the very goodness, the last section, the very goodness of the whole creation. So if that's not a reminder, and by the way, that word good, this translated good, can also be translated beautiful in the first chapter of Genesis. So it says, one of those last lines is, it is very beautiful. Yeah, why can't we agree on that? Of any persuasion or none? Atheists can agree on that. This trip out further into space, 1 million miles from it, is going on right now to get us more information from the new telescope. We're going to see a lot of beauty. We're going to see a lot of goodness. And the whole thing is such a marvel that we're here at all after 13.8 billion years, that we can do these things and look back at the beginning of the universe. And surely we're here to celebrate, aren't we? That's the bottom line. Whether you do it as a Buddhist or an atheist or a Presbyterian or a Jew doesn't matter to me, frankly. But do it, though. That matters a lot, because it's our thank you to celebrate. That's how you give thanks. But also, it's our survival. If we can't learn to get along through celebration and that kind of ritual and ceremony, we're doomed. We're just, on the one hand, we're too smart. On the other hand, we're too stupid to survive. We're too smart for our own riches on the one hand, and we have to temper our passions and wanting to defeat the other empire or whatever crazy thing we're into next. All this needs taming, and time's running out.
Yeah. So let's talk about a few of the tenets of original blessing that really go so much against, they're so counterintuitive when it comes to religion. For example, sins of the flesh take you toward God, sins of the spirit take you away from God. Could you elaborate?
That's a great line. It's from Thomas Aquinas. And it was such a great line. I built, I think I might have it right here. Yeah. I built one of my books on a real thick book, my book on evil, called Sins of the Spirit, Blessings of the Flesh, Transforming Evil in Soul and Society. I was so taken by that line from Aquinas, and I'd never heard it before. I translated a lot of stuff in Aquinas. It's never been translated before, and that was one of the lines. And I guess I know why it was never translated.
Right.
But I mean, when you think how many hours of preaching from pulpits has been about sins of the flesh, and no one ever said sins of the spirit are much worse, although Aquinas said it. And actually Hildegard, just the other day, I found it in Hildegard. She says the same thing. She says that lies are inhuman. No other creature lies. But sins of the flesh, she said, these are very human. We all do it, she says. But lies, this is something only humans do. And she actually called lying inhuman, which I think is important because we're living in a time of the big lie and many other lies that are literally bringing down our democracies. So, lying is a pretty important thing. But again, it's spiritual. And that means that it's the mind doing it, the mind connected to a perverse heart. The bad intention. But so Aquinas is saying that the list of the sins of the spirit, such as greed and avarice and the untruth, lying, but also envy and arrogance. They used to call it pride, but I think pride's a virtue, not a sin. But I think arrogance is a danger for sure. And there's plenty of that going around. And again, they used to talk, church fathers, about anger. I don't think anger is a sin. I think violence is dangerous. And that's, violence is a sin of the spirit because it kind of makes you as powerful to overcome others and so forth. And so domestic abuse and all kinds of forms of violence. So, and of course, hatred and fear, what you talked about earlier, fear would be one of these sins of the spirit, which is really the opposite of love, that you can't have fear and love operating together. And there are those teachings in the scriptures, like John's epistle, that says that love drives out fear. And I know psychologists who have built their whole practice on that, really. Jerry Jamplowski, I don't know his work, but the attitudinal healing movement is built on that, especially in that one principle, that love drives out fear. So, but again, it's such an insight from Aquinas that the sexual draws us to communion, draws us into intimacy, and can be, obviously, is an expression of love, and therefore it's not as off-center, which is the real meaning of sin in Judaism. It's missing the bullseye. It's an archery term, missing the bullseye. That sins of the flesh take you closer to the bullseye than do sins of avarice and greed and envy and arrogance and all these that take us, on another planet where we're running things, and where we're practicing power over dynamics instead of power with.
Hmm. And what about
But
the idea? Oh, go ahead.
But just one more word, that word flesh,
Yeah.
I play with that too in my book, because I love what David Bohm says, and what the new science says about how matter is frozen light, or very, very slow moving light. Because
Mm-hmm.
light, in the studies I've done, light is the primary synonym for the divine around the world. Every religion I've looked at wants to talk about God as light and us as enlightened in some way, that we get into our own light. And so to bring together light and matter is to totally re-understand matter. Matter is not the problem, which so many religious types have taught. In fact, it's exciting because incarnated light, which is matter, is rare in the universe. For every molecule of light that is not flesh, there are a billion molecules. Wait a minute. There are a billion molecules of light that are not flesh for every one molecule that is flesh. And so flesh is this amazing surprise, this awesome thing that's appeared in the universe. And it's not the problem. So to me, this turns a lot of our religious ideology inside out. And it should, because it's dangerous. And healthy religion has never really made that distinction. I mean, indigenous people wouldn't think of separating body from prayer, for example. And the sweat lodge, it's all bodily, but it's also profoundly spiritual. You're facing death, you're facing mystery, and you're uncomfortable. Unlike so many churches where you've got the air conditioning going and the heating going and the cushions going, and the big challenge is staying awake.
Right.
Whereas in a sweat lodge, the big challenge is staying alive.
Yeah. Have you ever done a sweat lodge?
Oh, many sweat lodges and sundances, and I've been very blessed by being invited to many Native American ceremonies, Vision Quest, and it's been in many ways my salvation in a way, because it kept me together during some very trying experiences in my life.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about self-love. The idea that self-love is the form and fruit of all friendship. To know and appreciate your worth is no sin. That's if you could take one tenet to my mind, that they want people to finally absorb, is that self-love is a virtue. It runs so counter to what we're taught.
Yeah, and again, I think that's a quote from Thomas Aquinas. He was amazing. And and of course there's right self-love and there's distorted self-love, of course. And that's the problem, that we don't distinguish between the two carefully. We just, like you say, we kind of lump it all and say, well, you have to love yourself. But again, the words from Jesus, love others as you love yourself, presumes that you love yourself. I mean, maybe he was naive, or maybe back then people knew what he was talking about. But as you say, in our day, it's more counterintuitive, as you say. But healthy self-love means, of course, that you get to know yourself and to appreciate your gifts and to know your weaknesses. And of course, it's Jung saying, deal with your weak side and your shadow side, of course, and that too, that we all carry a shadow, of course, and we've all have wounds, and some more than others. If you've had a difficult childhood, for example, difficult parents or what have you, or obviously, if you've been a victim, like victims of this priest abuse and all that as a child, of course, that never leaves you. It's a weight, an anchor that you carry with you your whole life. But even that is redemptive in the sense that people can move into some self-healing, for sure. And this is where psychology certainly contributes in our time, dealing with the shadow, dealing with the hurt, and listening, and deep listening around that, and getting over covering it up. It's the covering up that takes so much energy and interferes then with healthy self-love. I remember in my pedagogy and in all my places where I taught and created programs, we always had art as meditation, because that's how you bring in the right brain as well. I remember one time there was an art as meditation class in massage, doing massage, and of course receiving it, because that's part of doing it. And a fellow came to me, he was 41 years old, and he told me that he had forgotten. It was during massage that it came back, the massage class, that he had forgotten that when he was 6 years old, an aunt came every Friday and abused him for a year. And notice, but it was amazing, at 41, he had forgotten about that, which really means he had sat on it. Think about how much energy it took to forget that for 34 years or something. And I remember when he graduated from our program, he was 15 years younger than when he joined, that truth came through. And it didn't come through by talking to a therapist. It came through by artist meditation, by massage, that our body carries our pain. And I'm not saying a therapist isn't part of the solution, but my point is that there are many ways to get at the truth. And our bodies carry so much truth. And are we listening to them, you see? Because if we're not loving ourselves, we're not loving our bodies. And if we've been taught, that your body is a problem, that matter is going to drag you down and all that, well, then we're not listening to our body. And so the recovery of appreciating our existence, the fact that our bodies carry 13.8 billion years of history, literally, this is part of the wonder of being here in a body. And the body is not the problem. The body is, being asleep. The problem is being asleep to the awe that we've talked about. And our bodies are awesome. They just are. And they carry literally this history. And we should be honoring them every day.
Well, first we have to get over our fear of sex and our fear of death. And then I think the body won't be such a challenge.
Well, good luck.
Yeah. You talk about playfulness and fun being virtues. Is that a real central idea of original blessing and creation spirituality?
It is, definitely. And Aquinas really pushes that. He talks about the virtue of epikeia and eutropelia is the virtue of play, and then epikeia is the virtue of knowing when to suspend rules. Those are two virtues I've kind of memorized. Oh, when to suspend rules, that sounds good. This is coming from a saint and doctor of the church. And the second is play, how important play is. And he says that no one wants to be around someone who's a boor and can't play and isn't playful. And he actually says that the nearest word to contemplation is play, that contemplation is playing with wisdom. And of course, that's eros. And again, that's the divine feminine coming into the picture. Again, patriarchy wants to banish eros. And that's why we turn eros over to pornographers. And it's an unholy word in most circles. But in fact, play, there's a wonderful line in the Book of Wisdom that says, this is wisdom, to love life, to love life. Well, that includes play, doesn't it? And of course, play is part of creativity. As Jung says, there's no creativity without fantasy and play. So playing with our minds, that's really what I think learning is about, is learning to play with ideas, not to grip them so they become your crutch or your God.
Or your cudgel.
Exactly. There you go. Beat others over the head with it. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's so distorted. But I love playing with ideas. That's why I love these mystics. They're so wild. And when Eckhart says, I pray God to rid me of God. Oh, that says something about religion, doesn't it? And I think it speaks to a lot of people today, and so to play with new meanings of God. I wrote a book recently on 85 names for God. I call it the naming the unnameable, 85 wonderful and useful names for God. And I draw on science today, words like flow and energy and the mind of the universe, or the mind. One physicist has talked about God as the mind of the earth and so forth. I mean, there's so many ways to name and to play with the divine name, instead of this rigid thing filled with ideas you probably got when you were 6 years old, and Santa Claus in the sky or something. I mean, it's an insult. It's an insult to our own intelligence, saying nothing up to whatever divinity is and isn't. And so this whole invitation to play. Now, Aquinas has one of the most radical sentences I've ever read in my life. He's doing a commentary on the Book of Names, Divine Names by Denis Areopagite in the 6th century. And at one point he says, well, here are names that Denis has from Scripture. And he names about 50 things like the sun and the moon and justice and truth and all these names. And then Aquinas ends the whole section saying, God, every being in the universe is a name for God, and no being in the universe is a name for God. So to me, that's just shocking. The Vedas say that there are a million names for God, but Aquinas just said that there are trillions of names for God. Every being is a name for God, but no being is a name for God. So it's a both and thing, that we don't know God. It's all mystery, and it's nothing we can really name on the one hand, but on the other hand, every being we meet, this wonderful flower behind me is a name for God, and you're a name for God, and all the rest, maybe one of those books. So, it just opens the mind up. When I shared that concept in that book with a friend of mine, a cosmologist, Brian Swift, he said the top of his head came off when I added that one sentence from Aquinas about how every being is a name for God. I mean, that's playing. That's really playing with an idea and with a concept, the word God. And here we go to wars over my God versus your God. And my God, there are trillions of names for God. So, back off.
Right. So it's saying that everything is sacred. And this impulse to divide the sacred from the non-sacred is another patriarchal thing.
Absolutely. Sacred versus the profane. As if anything could be profane. If everything has a 13.8 billion year history, who are we to say it's profane? I had an experience a year ago. Well, it was before COVID, must have been 2 years ago, in a UU church on a Sunday morning. They invited me to come and talk about that book of mine that was new at the time about the names of God. And being in a UU church, I knew there'd be some atheists there. So I talked about the many names. And then I said, I want to speak to you atheists here. Now, I said, be a smart atheist, not a dumb atheist. A dumb atheist spends their life disproving the God of the 19th century or 18th century. Be a smart atheist and disprove these names that I've given you in the 21st century. Well, then there was a break when the service was over because there was a second service coming up, and I was signing books. This guy comes up about 40 years old. He said, I came to church an atheist this morning, and I'm not an atheist anymore. And I said, my goodness, you mustn't have been a very devout atheist to have given it up and just after one sermon. Well, he said, you hit it on the head. He said, I have been fighting an 18th and 19th century version of God. But what you talked about today, I'm not an atheist anymore.
Right. That's great.
So anyway, that was kind of funny.
I love that. I didn't realize that Julian had invented the word enjoy.
Yeah. Well, she invented a lot of words. She was the first woman to write a book in English, after all. And of course, few people know that. But think what courage that took on her part and confidence, But yeah, she invented the word enjoy. She invented the word wanting, O-N-E-I-N-G, which is a wonderful word for mysticism, experience of wanting. And she invented many words. And talk about non-dualism. She has some beautiful statements about what she calls the glory of the body and the soul together, and she followed Aquinas in that. Again, both of them turning their back on Platonism and that dualism. And she says that God is in our sensuality. That's a literal sentence from Julian. God is in our sensuality. And she's not running from it. And of course, this is very womanly too. I think women have had a hard time trying to go along with the patriarchal dualism that dominates our culture. Rosemary Ruther, a great feminist theologian, said that dualism is a basis of patriarchy, matter versus spirit and so forth, that is built on that. That's why efforts to undo the dualism and get to non-dualism in the very process, undo patriarchy. You know?
That's beautifully said. What do you think about the psychedelic revolution? What do you think about using plant medicines and substances to open vision, open the heart? Is that something that you support?
I know many people, good people, who have had breakthroughs and awakenings through that method, including Rupert Sheldrake, who I've written a couple books with, and who's a scientist, of course, and who was very influenced by Father B. Griffith, whom he met in India. But many people, I've had students, for example, some of my best students had that experience before they went into my class on religious studies way back at Barrett College. So I can't be against it on the one hand. On the other, I do caution, I myself have not gone that path. And I do think there are risks involved for sure. Some people who go with that path, get chemically unbalanced, or they also, or others may get addicted or something. So I just think it is a risk, and especially if you do it outside a sacred context. If you're doing it within a ritual ceremony, which is how the indigenous people did it, that's one thing. But if you do it more or less privately or kind of, on your own trip, I think there's risk in that too. So to me, it's a statement almost of how lame religion has become, that we're not providing the kind of rituals and ceremonies that can really inspire people, bring spirit in. And so people feel they have to go that path to touch another world, if you will, a bigger world. So in many ways, I think it's another statement about the failure of organized religion and how we wandered from religion as an experience, a spiritual experience, to religion as a structure serving itself more than awakening people. But again, I think this is why I'm drawn to the mystics so much, because they were all high, but not on outside substances, but on practices that clearly awakened them and deepened them. And a lot of it had to do with art or the language and response. I think of John of the Cross, of course, who went through a very near-death experience of torture by his own brothers in his community. And then he escaped one night and so forth. Then he wrote his great poem on the Dark Night, that which brought together all the levels of the sociological levels of the darkness and his personal struggle, of course, because he knew that night if he got captured, they would kill him. They'd already been torturing him, but they would kill him. So it was facing death that he took that risk. But then he ends up being one of the greatest poets of the West. So, and that poem is his most famous poem. So there's a death and dying that we do on a regular basis if we're really living life honestly and fully. And that is the pattern that the mystics play with and tell us about. And we all are mystics, so we all go through this consciously or unconsciously. So anyway, I know that some people have profited by going the way of roots and plants, but do they come back in the sense, do they become prophets? Or do they get so, what should I say, so committed to that path that they don't see what comes next? It's the prophet is the mystic in action. And the plants bring you into some mystical experiences, but do they lead you to the fulfillment of the spiritual path, which I think is service and compassion and the transformation of society and of others? So that's a question that has to be asked. Again, when it comes to individual stories, certainly someone like Rupert Sheldrake, I praise that very much.
Mhm.
But I have met some people who've gone that path who have not returned. That is the path becomes a god for them, if you will. And
So it becomes an idol. It becomes a
an
false
idol, exactly. It becomes an idol or an addiction, which is the same thing.
Same thing.
And so there's definitely danger inherent to it. And yeah.
Let me just ask you one last question. If you were to come across yourself as a young man, as a young priest who is in this architecture trying to find himself, what advice would you give him? If you could come back and give yourself some word of wisdom, what have you learned?
Don't be naive about institutions.
Right.
I think that's maybe the biggest and hardest lesson that I've learned. On the one hand, on the other hand, naivete I've learned can be a virtue because it allows you to fly above things for a while until you crash, until they catch up with you. But I certainly have learned something about naivete around institutions and religious institutions among them, and educational institutions as well. So, Gregory Bateson said that he asked the question: are we? How does he put it now? Are we slowly? The phrase he uses is very strong. What is it? Are we slowly killing our minds from a deteriorating religion and education? Although his phrase is a little more striking than that, but that's what he means. Religion and education, he felt, had failed us. Of course, he's writing in the 1970s. And I've committed my life to both things, religion and education. But I found myself having to reinvent both. And so it's been worthwhile, but it's been a lot of uphill struggle as well. So I think I would have wanted to tell my younger self that, of course, I love that line from Gandhi, to prepare yourself for mountains. If you want to transform society, prepare yourself for mountains of suffering. So I think that's good advice from Gandhi or anyone.
I'm really happy to speak to you today. Thank you so much. I really think of you as a prophet for our time, and I'm so grateful for you. I'm grateful for your work.
Well, thank you. I'm grateful for yours and your prophetic work, because by offering people not only your own writing, but by offering others a platform like this, you're interfering too. So we're in it together.
We're in it together. Good.
Thank you, Mark.
Take good care. Be well. Thank you.
Bye now.